Okay, so I'm the only reason I'm going to put something on Monday to avoid putting something on Wednesday because I have something else in my other class on Thursday. So I'm going to make it Monday and Monday. And 21 and 28. And then if I need to, I will deal with the person taking the chemistry test separately. So I'm going to put tests Monday and Monday. That also avoids the guy who can't always make it on Wednesdays. Avoids the guy who giving back-to-back tests to the guy who's in my other programming class. And I will deal with the person taking the chemistry test separately if need be. Okay, so that's what we'll do. Monday the 21st and then Monday the 28th. This class has a two-part exam just to prevent me from putting everything but the kitchen sink into one test, which I have a tendency to do. And okay, and it's labs 1 through 7. So this lab 7 that was due on the 16th, that is fair game. Oh, I see. So that is fair game, but what I'm doing today, XML is not. So the XML won't be on the test. The fetching of a file may be on the test. And I usually sort of do it in pieces, like, oh, here's the data in a file, but if you can't fetch the file, here's the text for you to parse. You might lose some points by skipping the fetching part, but you'll be able to do the other stuff. Okay, so, but, so there will be 2 parts. One part will focus on interfacing. We'll have checkboxes and radio buttons and drop-down lists, and it will all be about interfacing, getting information off the screen, doing something with it, presenting it back to the user. And then there will be a more data-driven part where there will probably be a bunch of objects, either in a file we have to parse or in JSON, which sort of comes parsed. And you've seen my examples by now, something in a drop-down list and then a little bit more. Okay, so let me check this, see anybody new. Okay, so tests next Monday and the following Monday, and labs 1 through 7. So labs 1 through 7 are due to be eligible for full credit. Labs 1 through 7 are due by the second date on March 21, but at 11:59 that night. So you can do all 7 labs after you've taken the second half of the test. That would be stupid, but you could do it and still get full credit. And then the homeworks up to, I'll say homework 4, all right? Yes, homework 4 was still within that same. So homeworks 1, 2, 3, 4, labs 1 to 7, that's the material for the test. The material is more about the labs than the homework, but the homework is still due at the same time to be eligible for full credit. Questions? All right. So if I've shown you in some of the interfacing things, I've often sort of done it like 3 times at various levels of sophistication. You'll be able to choose whichever level you want, so long as you get the job done. When it comes, you can't, like if there's supposed to be a loop, you can't just write out like 20 different things individually. I mean, that would be nuts. But you can have an on-click within the button, or you can add an event listener. It can be an anonymous function or a named function. You can, if I give you a file and say, here's all the information, now load up the options in a drop-down select, then you must load them up. But if I say, here are the choices, small, medium, or large, and put them in a drop-down, if that's all I say, then you can add them dynamically, or you can hard code them. Be careful that I sometimes give you, if the interface is complicated, especially on the interfacing exam, the interface may be, there may be lots of radio buttons and checkboxes. I will tend to give you things. I do not give you everything. Just because I hand you some part of an interface doesn't mean I've given you everything you need. I tend to skip the important stuff. Radio buttons are grouped by names. I tend to skip that to see if you know it. It's very useful behind the scenes to have values. I tend to skip that to see if you know it. So I try to save you some typing, but I save the important things. Do you know how it really works for you to fill in? Some people think I've given an interface, they should just move straight to the JavaScript and they have no work to do in the HTML, and that is wrong. Okay, one more time. Any questions about test, old labs? Okay, no. So XML, move on to new material. And I'm not even sure XML will be on test 2. XML may be on test 3. That's the way it often ends up. Because after lab 8, we start a big topic of React. And so XML might get lost in the mix of the difficulties of React. So we'll see. But in this course, I've often put the XML off way to the end. Okay. I'm going to show you 2 XML fetching files. They're very similar. But there's at least one important distinction that points out the problem that students often don't pay attention to the file, what's in the file they're reading. Okay, so I downloaded it, I extracted it. I'm going to open my Visual Studio Code. I am going to open Visual Studio Code. I'm going to open a folder. I'm not opening the file, I'm opening the folder. Dog fetch. And so that's down here. And I'm doing that because I'm going to use the live server. The live server wants you to open a folder. And here is the HTML then. So I have the live server. I've shown you this before. I have the live server installed. I opened up a folder. I picked the HTML file, and I'm going to right click and open with the live server. And there are my dogs, and pick a dog and show information about the dog. Okay, very good. All right, so here's the HTML. There's a link to the CSS. The CSS is mainly about the grid styling. So my spans have italics, font. The wrapper and the box is about the grid. And what else? Anything else in the style? No, it's all about the grid. Where are certain divs positioned, and some of them have a span. So this is the image one, so it spans 5 rows. So that's the CSS. Here's the actual HTML. Again, it's all about the grid. Here is this div with the class wrapper that makes it a grid style. They all share the class box, and then they have their individual properties, which specify which column and row they're in, and do they span or not. There's a select, there's an image, there's a span for the height, a span for the group, a span for the colors, a span for the description. I have a class, and I have code that uses that class. So that's the HTML. The class is just a data-driven class. It's just saying, here's all this information about a dog, keep it together. So instead of running around with a bunch of parallel arrays, let's have an array of dogs, and then dogs have all these individual little properties. So the only important thing in the constructor is to pay attention to the order here of the properties, what we call the signature. So that the constructor has a signature. So these are all the same type. These are all strings. So it's not too terrible. But all of us, if all of a sudden you see the dog's height where it should be the description, then you probably screwed up the order of the properties in the constructor versus the use of the constructor. Okay, so that is the class. Now, one distinction, we went from CSV, that's where we started with files. And when we had a CSV, we made our own class, and then we made objects of that class. When we moved to JSON, then we could drop the definition of the class, because the class structure or the object structure was built into the file itself. So the properties were named within within the JSON itself, and it was understood. The JS in JSON is JavaScript, so it was understood by JavaScript how to handle this stuff. XML is this weird in between thing. So it's clear in the CSV file that there's just data and we don't know what the data is, so we need the class. And in JSON, you not only have that this dog is brown, but you have that it is a bloodhound or something. So we know that it is or that brown is the dog's color. So the property value and the property name sort of are combined in JSON. They're going to be combined in XML, but XML is sort of almost like too extensible. You could do too many things with XML. It's too confusing. And so we're going to have to make a class again. And as we get the information out of XML, put it into a class. So we're back to needing a class. Okay, that was a long blathering. Okay, now let's use this class. That's a dog. There's to use the class. Okay. So what do we have? The main event is a change of the drop-down list. So that I tend to put those things up the top. What are the actions? That could go anywhere, but I just tend to put them at the top to say what events are the events of interest. And the only event of interest here is a change in the drop-down list. I'm going to have an array. It's going to be an array of dogs. I am fetching the file. Okay, so we started this last week, but this is the sort of new idea of fetching the file. If you have not been using the live server, I've been using the live server since the beginning, but some of you have been opening things your own way, good and fine until now. Once you start fetching something, it's not good and fine to just open the web page any old way. You need to open it like the right way, that there are security measures that prevent you from opening from a web page opening, from JavaScript opening a local file. And so that's why we need to pretend we're a server. Okay. And we're using fetch. Now, somebody was having trouble with the fetch and they looked up all this old crap. Fetch is the new version of this that deals with all this asynchronous. So if you're like looking something up on the web and you're in async and all this kind of crap, then you're doing it the old hard way. Fetch is like the modern new way, which is going to build into a lot of that stuff for you. So if you looked on the internet, there's all sorts of code on the internet for you to look up, and if you're seeing all this old async stuff, run away. It's old, it's harder than it needs to be, stop it. Okay. Maybe ask a question every now and again. Okay, so fetch the name of the file. I only have the name of the file. That means that this file is a sibling of the JavaScript, which is the case. So here's my XML and here's the JavaScript using the Java. Here's the use dog class JavaScript. Here's the XML. They are siblings. So all I need is the name of the file. But we could fetch like HTTP, yada, yada, yada. We could fetch off of the internet. So we are making, we have to think of this as a request and then this as a response. So we are requesting a resource and then the response is coming back. And a response could have a number of things. If you're familiar from your 220 class or something, that an HTML response can have a number of things like a status. Like sometimes you've occasionally tried to go to a page that wasn't there and you've got like the error message that that page doesn't exist. So the response may have a number of things. All we're saying here is that we want the text. So we started in CSV, we started with text. Then when we had JSON, it was smart enough, it knew enough about JSON that we said JSON. Now we're XML, XML's old and it's too extensible, can do too many things, it's too confusing. And so we're back to text. Then we move on to, and what this does, this double then does, is allows you to sort of forget everything, but everything in the response except the one thing you want, which is the text. Okay. Here's an important line. Let me close the Explorer. Okay. 10 is an important line. It says that the CSV file was simple enough that we just parsed it ourselves. We said, oh, I know what that is. There are delimiters. I parse on the delimiters. That's easy. XML is complicated, and we don't want to be looking for open tags and closed tags and matching things like that. We are going to use something that understands XML. And so in line 10 here, we're saying use something that understands XML and point it at the data that we just fetched. Okay. So use things that are available to you that make life easy. So don't go to old versions of asynchronous blah, blah, blah. Use fetch. Bring in a parser that understands XML. And then now we're at the stage where we need to know more than just if it's XML, but we need to know what the XML looks like. So let's have a quick peek at this XML. I had the dogs originally as a CSV file, then later I had them as a JSON file. I used some converter to make them XML, and this was what it made. So it started off with XML tag. It made a root tag, and then it had tags called dogs, and that is a repeated tag. In the way we're going to work through this next thing, it's important to know what's repeated and what's not. So root is not repeated, but dogs is repeated. And dog name is repeated and dog height is repeated. And so we need to know these names of the tags, and we need to know which tags are sort of like one-off and which tags are repeated. Okay. So use the class. Okay. So I'm using a very old-fashioned loop here. I'm using This is similar to what we've, now I'm not working with the document, but with the parser. The document would refer to the HTML, but I'm asking something about the XML. So, and what knows about the XML is the parser. So I'm working with the parser, but it's similar to the document because they're both tag based. And so now I'm working with get elements. Notice the S, get elements with an S by tag. So I'm going over to the XML and I'm getting a group of things. I'm getting an array of things, everything with the name, everything with the tag dog name. So that's a whole set of things. I'm giving it a square bracket I. That means I'm picking out the ith one. So I have a loop, starts at 0, goes up to the dogs. Dogs was one of my repeated tags. And so dogs was an array and it had a length. I think maybe there are 10 dogs. So length was like 10. So I'm in a loop that goes from 0 up to not including 10. And now I'm going to my parser. I'm getting the tags that have the tag dog name. I'm getting the ith one. I'm getting its child. So in XML, I can have tags within tags. I could have like dog name is within dogs. But right now I'm looking at dog name. And I could have other tags in there. I don't. But I'm asking for the first thing that's in there, the first child, which is bulldog. So that's the child node 0, the first child. And then that could be a tag, or in this case, it's just text. So I'm grabbing its node value. Okay, so that's a long line. And you have to understand that there are a bunch of things with the tag called dog's name. So when I say get elements by tag name, there are a bunch of them. I'm getting the ith one, so that's one tag. It can have multiple children. It happens to only have one child, but so I'm getting the 0th child, the only child, and I'm grabbing the node value, the text that's in there. So this was bulldog, and then I assign bulldog to dog name. And I similarly grab the height and the colors and the description and the group and the image. I had to know what these were named for what we're doing right here to work. If you don't look at the file, you say, oh, I know what Blum's like, and oh, it will be, the next one is cat, and he'll say cat name and cat height and cat colors and cat description. And then maybe I don't say cat, cat, cat. Maybe I just say name, height, colors. Then you're screwed. You must look at the file. You must know what's coming in the file, or you can't take this approach. It's case sensitive, so you got to pay attention to that. You can put little consoles in here. So sometimes when I'm having trouble and I can't find out what's wrong, somewhere in the loop it dies, then I'll have a console log. Each time I get a little bit, I put a console log here, I put it here, I put it here, and I keep going until it fails, and then I know what's wrong. And then if my focus is attention on one thing, you can usually figure it out. But that's how I sometimes get through these things when it's going wrong. But if I pay attention from the start, I usually do all right. Okay, so I grabbed all my properties from the file. Here I am consoling out just to see something, to make sure I know what's going on. And then I use the word new. So I'm using my constructor. This is the name of my class. So I'm making an object of my class. I have to pay attention between the class, dog name, height, name, height, colors, description, and here, name, height, colors, description. So make sure I match that signature with my property order. And so I made a loop through, parsed the file, made an array of made dog objects and added them to my array. I could do the select in the same loop, and you've seen me do that at least once, where I made this the same loop, but here I made it a separate loop. Here's my select. I'm looping over my dog objects, my array of dog objects. I'm creating a new option. I'm making the text, the name of the dog. I'm making the value, the index, and I'm adding that option to my select. I am using the math library, taking a random number between 0 and 1, multiplying it by the length of the dog array. I'm taking the floor of that. That's a random index. I set the value of my dropdown to that random index, and then I create a change event and dispatch it. That makes the user, it seem like the user's chosen a random dog. So when I refresh, it's like the user chose a random dog, except it was Bloodhound for 3 times in a row. But now it's random. Okay, that can happen. All right, and here's my function for select. Go to the page, grab the value, which is an index, grab the dog with that index, use the properties of that dog. The height, the group, the height, the colors, the description are all inner HTML of various spans. That's one thing that you guys struggle with in the beginning. When to use value, when to use inner HTML. Divs have inner HTML, spans have inner HTML. If you're putting something into a text input, then it's value. If you're putting something into a multi-line text, a text area, that's you can use either with there, but I have more luck with value. And then the dog image was a source. So these were inner HTML, and this was a source. And that's another thing that people tend to get messed up when they're going fast. They'll copy this and it will say inner HTML, and they'll copy all the way down inner HTML. And then they're trying to change the inner HTML of the image tag. And there's no such thing. The image tag is a singleton, so it doesn't have an inner HTML. And even if it did have an inner HTML, it wouldn't show you the picture that you want. All right. So that was the dogs. I'm going to just do it all again, go even faster for my new wave XML example, but there's going to be one difference in the XML file. And I want to point out that. And then I did one new thing, which, well, maybe 2 new things. In addition to having the source of an image, I had the source of an iframe. So, and another thing was I made a hyperlink. And there's also one difference in the data file. So I want to show you another example just so that you pay attention to some of these nuances. So here is the new wave example. Here's the new wave example. Okay, I think I already had it downloaded. So I'm going to, again, in Visual Studio, I'm going to open the folder. I'll do the first one I had downloaded, the new wave. If you're going to work with the live server, you want to open a folder. So here's my HTML. I don't want that. New wave HTML. This used to be a test, and new wave is the sort of HTML that I handed to students. I want new wave underscore Blum. That's the one that's actually solved. Open with a live server. And here is my new wave. Okay. So same usual thing, some big grid styling here, some drop down of information that changes. And it's got an image, it's got information. Here is one of the new things, an iframe that has a source. So we're going to treat it just almost like the image. And then there's this hyperlink this Wikipedia hyperlink. So, okay. So let's play the game one more time, point out what's the same and what has changed. That's usually the game with these sort of things. Okay, so there was a style. Here was the style. I chose hot pink and black because that was very new wavy. Here's my wrapper and my box. And this time around, I put the little individual things, I used inline style. So here's the shared style. Here's the wrapper that makes it a grid. Here's the individual styling for all the little boxes. And then if something spanned 2 columns or anything like that, I made that inline style. So that's over in the HTML. So that's one change here, not an important change, but a change nevertheless. So now over in the HTML, here's that wrapper div. Here is the div, the first div of the grid. And here's my little additional styling that this one span 2 columns. So that's the drop down that spans 2 columns. So here's a column, here's a column. This one spans 2 columns. So I can add that. Before, what I used to do is give this first thing box, but I'd also make it maybe class A. And then I would put this style over under class A. Instead, I just put it straight here in line in the div that it applies to. So you can put style, you can put CSS in different places. So just pointing that out. Here's the empty select. Here's the image with no source. Here's an iframe with no source. And here are spans. You don't need spans. A div is already a place where you can put things, but I decided to make a span. If I did not have a span and I just had a div, again, remember, if you want to code something, you should give it an ID. So if I didn't have the span, and you wanted to work straight with the div, which is also a container, so it's perfectly fine, you would just give the div an ID. And I talked about that we're going to have a test, and that I will give you some HTML often, but not everything. And an ID is something that I would tend to hold back from you. So I would tend to say oh, it's important that you know that in JavaScript, you identify things based on their IDs. And so you should know that it's important to give things IDs. And some people will go through all kinds of torturous ways to access something rather than just give it an ID. I'm telling you now, if the easy thing to do is give it an ID, then give it an ID. I'm not handing you HTML that you're not allowed to touch. I'm not handing you CSS that you're not allowed to touch. I'm handing you HTML and CSS to save you a bit of time and a bit of typing. But I still expect you to know them, how to operate them, how to make your life easier. And so don't make your life hard, make your life easy. Okay, so that's the HTML. Here is the class, the new wave class, NW class. And again, it's just pure data driven. If I give you a class on one of these tests coming up, I'm likely to throw in a method because a class can have a method. So I'll probably try to think up some silly little throwaway method to make sure, just to emphasize the idea that a class, it's not all just data, but that there are methods. But usually my focus is on the data. But there could be points on the test that's coming up for you guys. There may be a method in the class. Okay. And then we need to use the class, and this is almost the same. go to the select. I give points on tests. That's why I have, it's not that it's like, I like to see my name. It's that I give points for you putting your name in different ways on the test. So I usually have put your name in the title, and you get a point. Put your name as an HTML comment, get a point. Put your name in the header, get a point. The header goes in the body. The header does not go in the head. If you put the header in the head, it will work. And I'll take off, I don't know, 1/10 of a point because it doesn't belong there. The header, the title is the only thing in the header that you can see on the page because that's the name of the tab. Everything else that you see on the page should be in the body. So the browsers are nice enough that if you have a header up here in the head, they'll throw it down into the body, but I'm not as nice as the browsers. I will take off a little bit of points. Not a lot to make a difference, but enough to annoy you because I'm annoyed. So I want you to be annoyed so that you'll get it right the next time. Okay. What else are we doing here? Okay. So I have a change event. So I have an array. I'm fetching the XML file. It's a sibling. It's this two-stage then. I set up the parser. Again, this example is mostly the same. Here's a different thing. Okay. My loop is set up over element. So let's look at the XML file. New Wave XML, here it is. I have the XML tag, I have the root tag, I have a songs tag. I just go up to the internet, I usually have this data in some other file. XML is not my natural first tendency of data file. It's kind of outdated, but they're still out there in the world, so you should see them. But then I'll use some converter. So this converter, the last converter said this was dogs, and dogs was repeated. And in this converter, I had songs, and songs is not repeated. Element is repeated. Art is repeated, artist is repeated, but songs is not repeated. So somebody looked at my first example, but not my second example, and didn't look at the data file, will just say like, oh, songs is in this one what dogs was in the other one. No, it's not. It's important to know that in the previous example, dogs was a repeated tag. And here in this XML, songs is a sort of a single one-off tag. It's not, it's got an open and a close, so I shouldn't, it's not a single thing. But this tag songs only appears once. Different from dogs in our previous example where dogs appeared many times. The repeating thing this time is element. Okay. So my loop is I start at 0, parser, get elements by tag name element. That's the repeated one. That's the one with a length of however many songs I have, probably 10. I usually like 10, I don't know. Although I might have gone more, like if there's some song I really like and it's the 12th most popular new wave song, I might go 12 or something. But I usually run out of steam after a while. So here's my loop over the element tags. There was an art tag, and again, it's child node 0, node value. I won't put tags within tags within tags in XML. I'll just keep it pretty simple when I give you XML. XML will not be on test 1. Probably won't be on test 2. It'll probably come back in test 3. But here's the usual game, blah, blah, blah. Okay, just get used to this. And the big thing is what's repeated, elements repeated, songs is not repeated. If you chose songs instead of element, there is one song. And so your loop will be over one thing. You'll just get one song. You'll say, what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong? Make a class, pay attention to the order of your arguments. Go to the select, loop over the array, make options, make the title, make the, so this is all the same. I'm picking, this is the same. I'm picking a random new wave song. I'm going here, I'm handling the select change, getting the value, which is an index from select song, picking the object with that index, and then using the properties artist to set the inner HTML, year, label, writer. Image was a source. I'm going to come back to the Wikipedia in a minute. Image was a source, not an inner HTML. And this is IF or iframe, and that is a source. So you have to know what element you're using and what property they want. These were all spans. They wanted inner HTML. The image and the iframe, they wanted a source. And then here we have, I'm making an anchor tag. So this is an anchor tag is a hyperlink. It's angle bracket A, target equals underscore blank. That makes it open a new tab rather than replace the page you're on. href is the property that's the URL where you're going to. And then there's an open anchor tag, a close anchor tag, and then the words between are what the hyperlink says. So my hyperlink said wiki. And I had the full Wikipedia URL. There have been times, I think people have been doing the labs have seen where I maybe have you go over to YouTube and show an embedded video. And then the URL is usually for embedding a video almost always the same, except then there's one code that changes. So sometimes in Wikipedia, in the XML file, I gave you the full URL, and then, where am I here? But when I'm taking you over to YouTube, I often give you just a code. And that's another thing you have to pay attention to. In the data file, did I give you the full-blown URL? Did I give you something that you add to the URL? Now, how much of the URL are you responsible for? I've had people, I've given them full URLs, and then they're adding to my URL, which is already a full URL. Or I have people trying to go to a URL and only handing me a code. You know, it's just a matter of paying attention, pay attention. Now, this was my version of the test. I had people make an anchor tag, give it an ID, and then just use code to change the href property. It's another way to do it, probably better than what I did. So it's another approach. I'm an old concatenator from way back, but that's probably an overkill way to do it. We know how to make an element to change a property of the element, so that's another way to go. So those were the differences. I added an iframe. You work with it like an image. I added a hyperlink. So you have to know what a hyperlink looks like, and you have to put in the part that changes. There are different ways to do that. Pay attention to whether I give you a full URL or part of a URL. And the other big change here was this thing that looked like it played the same role as dogs in the other file does not play the same role as dogs in the other file, because dogs was repeated and songs is not. All right, any questions? No. All right, so I will stop recording.